On an ordinary Tuesday, Walmart, the nation's largest retailer and a symbol of American shopping, issued a stark warning. President Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods would soon hit American shoppers' wallets. This wasn't just a corporate statement, it was a wake-up call for millions of families who rely on Walmart for affordable prices on everything from groceries to school supplies. The company's announcement shattered the long-held belief that only foreign nations would bear the brunt of tariffs. Suddenly, the trade war's impact was no longer a distant political debate. It was about to become a daily reality for millions of Americans. News headlines blared warnings and social media buzzed with concern as people realized their weekly budgets might not stretch as far as before. No longer an abstract policy issue, the cost of groceries, clothing, and household essentials was about to rise. Shoppers who once breezed through the aisles now paused, double-checking price tags and feeling the pinch at the checkout counter. For many, the increase in prices meant making tough choices, cutting back on non-essentials or searching for cheaper alternatives. Walmart, a company built on the promise of everyday low prices, now faced a difficult dilemma. Should they absorb the extra costs and risk shrinking their already thin profit margins, or pass those costs on to their price-sensitive customers? The decision wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet, it was about the trust and loyalty of millions of shoppers who counted on Walmart to keep their costs down. President Trump publicly challenged Walmart to absorb the tariffs, intensifying the pressure on the retail giant. The administration argued that big companies could shoulder the burden, but for Walmart, the reality was more complicated. With razor-thin margins and fierce competition, every cent mattered. As the country's largest private employer, Walmart's warning carried significant weight. Other major retailers like Target and Best Buy watched closely, knowing they might soon face the same tough choices. The entire retail industry braced for a ripple effect, as suppliers, workers, and customers all wondered how the new tariffs would change their daily lives. The announcement signaled a turning point. The trade war was no longer just a distant policy battle waged in Washington or Beijing. It had become a direct threat to Main Street, affecting small businesses, local economies, and the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. The uncertainty spread beyond Walmart's aisles, reaching into communities across the country. The ripple effect threatened to trigger price hikes across the entire retail sector. Economists warned that higher prices could dampen consumer spending, slow economic growth, and even threaten jobs. Shoppers everywhere began to wonder, how much more would they have to pay? Would their paychecks keep up with rising costs? Walmart's message was clear and urgent. Tariffs would not remain an overseas issue. Instead, they would land squarely at the checkout counter, showing up on receipts and in the wallets of everyday Americans. The cost of trade policy was about to become visible in every transaction. The debate over who pays for tariffs was no longer theoretical. It was about to become deeply personal for every American shopper. As families faced higher bills and tighter budgets, the true cost of the trade war would be measured not in political points, but in the everyday choices made at the heart of American life. President Trump's tariffs sent shockwaves through global markets, sparking widespread anxiety and uncertainty among investors, businesses, and governments alike. The announcement of new trade barriers was met with immediate volatility, as financial analysts scrambled to assess the potential impact on global supply chains and economic growth. Around the world, markets responded with sharp fluctuations, reflecting the deep interconnectedness of today's economies. While some U.S. stocks rallied on hopes of a manufacturing revival and increased domestic production, international markets grew increasingly uneasy. Investors worried about retaliatory measures from other countries, and the possibility of a prolonged trade war loomed large. The optimism on Wall Street contrasted sharply with the nervousness seen in markets across Europe, Asia, and beyond. The tariffs generated billions in new revenue for the U.S. Treasury, but this came at a cost. Decades of predictable rules-based trade were suddenly disrupted, leading to confusion at ports and customs checkpoints. Shipping delays became more common, and businesses faced new layers of bureaucracy and uncertainty. Export-driven nations like Brazil and Switzerland felt immediate pressure, scrambling to adapt to the new reality. Their industries, heavily reliant on access to U.S. markets, faced declining orders and logistical headaches. Companies in these countries began searching for alternative buyers and new trade partners, but the transition was anything but smooth. In response, governments around the world rushed to negotiate exemptions and new terms, highlighting just how deeply the world's economies are intertwined. Diplomatic efforts intensified, with leaders seeking to protect their industries and minimize the fallout from escalating trade tensions. Economists warned of rising inflation and widespread supply chain disruptions, as the cost of imported goods increased and critical components became harder to source. Companies were forced to rethink their investment strategies, with many delaying or canceling planned expansions due to the unpredictable business environment. Investment decisions stalled as corporations hesitated in the face of rapidly changing trade rules. Boardrooms across the globe were filled with uncertainty, as executives weighed the risks of moving forward against the potential for further policy shifts. The stability that once defined global commerce gave way to a new era of strategic ambiguity and tension. Shipping routes slowed, and international business meetings became fraught with concern over what the future might hold. Tariffs quickly became a symbol of a fracturing global order, forcing every nation and corporation to adapt their strategies. The old playbook for international trade was no longer reliable, and leaders everywhere were forced to rethink their approach. The future of international trade was suddenly uncertain, with old certainties gone and new challenges emerging. As volatility became the new normal, the world watched and waited, unsure of what the next chapter in global commerce would bring. At the heart of Trump's trade agenda was a high-stakes confrontation with China. This wasn't just another policy dispute, it was a bold gamble that would test the economic strength and political will of both nations. The world watched as the two largest economies entered a tense standoff, each side determined to protect its interests and assert its dominance on the global stage. The administration paused tariff escalation for 90 days, hoping for progress on issues like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and market access. This temporary truce was meant to create space for meaningful negotiations, but it was also a race against time, with both sides under pressure to deliver results to their domestic audiences. Beneath the truce, both sides prepared for a prolonged conflict. American officials strategized behind closed doors, while Chinese leaders mobilized their industries and braced for further economic turbulence. The atmosphere was one of deep mistrust, with each move scrutinized for hidden motives. China responded by urging tech firms to reduce reliance on U.S. components, signaling a push for self-sufficiency. This marked the beginning of a new era in which China sought to accelerate its own technological development, investing heavily in research and innovation to close the gap with the West. The U.S. adopted a policy of reciprocity, tariffs for tariffs, even with allies. This approach sent shockwaves through global markets, as countries scrambled to adjust to the new reality of unpredictable trade barriers and shifting alliances. This aggressive approach marked a sharp break from decades of multilateral trade deals. For years, the U.S. had championed open markets and international cooperation, but now, the focus shifted to bilateral deals and hard-nosed negotiations. The standoff with China became the defining feature of a new, unpredictable trade policy. Headlines around the world tracked every twist and turn, as investors and businesses tried to anticipate the next move in this high-stakes game. While aiming to protect American industries, the strategy risked alienating allies and disrupting supply chains. Many U.S. companies faced higher costs, and some sectors struggled to adapt to the new tariffs and uncertainty. The outcome of this U.S.-China dance would shape global commerce for years. The world's economic future hung in the balance as leaders, businesses, and workers everywhere waited to see who would blink first, and what the new rules of global trade would be. Tariffs sent shockwaves through the U.S. economy, hitting industries from agriculture to tech. Small businesses lacking financial buffers struggled with rising costs for materials and goods. Farmers faced retaliatory tariffs, losing access to key export markets. Major companies like GE and Apple began shifting investments in manufacturing to avoid tariffs. This reconfiguration of supply chains raised questions about American jobs and the goal of bringing manufacturing home. Yet the pressure also spurred innovation. Companies invested in automation and efficiency to survive. Some industries, like steel, saw short-term gains, but many others faced new headwinds. The modern economy's complexity meant that protecting one sector could harm another. The story was one of disruption and adaptation, with both costs and opportunities emerging. President Trump publicly called on Walmart to absorb tariff costs, thrusting the retailer into the political spotlight. Walmart's CFO responded bluntly. Avoiding price hikes was nearly impossible under the new tariffs. Everyday items like bananas and car seats could see prices jump by nearly 30%. The administration claimed tariffs were a tax on China, but Walmart's reality showed costs would hit American consumers. The retailer's dilemma, sacrifice profits or raise prices, mirrored the challenge facing the entire U.S. retail sector. Tariffs threatened the global supply chains that kept prices low. Walmart's struggle became a case study in how trade policy quickly impacts American households. Tariffs brought a new fear inflation. Economists warned that making imports more expensive would drive up prices across the board. Companies like Walmart, operating on thin margins, had little choice but to pass costs to consumers. If widespread, these price hikes could erode purchasing power and slow economic growth. Higher prices meant less discretionary spending, threatening the engine of the U.S. economy. Businesses facing higher costs might delay hiring or investment. The Federal Reserve watched closely, wary of inflation's return. The risk of tariffs fueling inflation became a central challenge for policymakers. The Federal Reserve faced a delicate balancing act amid tariff-driven uncertainty. Chair Jerome Powell held interest rates steady, aiming to stabilize the economy while assessing the trade war's impact. President Trump publicly pressured the Fed to cut rates, but the central bank resisted, prioritizing data over politics. The Fed worried that cutting rates could fuel inflation, especially with rising import costs. This standoff underscored the tension between political demands and economic stewardship. The Fed's independence and data-driven approach reassured markets, even as risks mounted. Navigating the unpredictable fallout of trade policy became a defining challenge for the central bank. America's aggressive tariffs sparked swift retaliation from global trading partners. China, the EU, and others imposed their own tariffs, targeting key U.S. exports and escalating the conflict. High-stakes negotiations dominated headlines, with the world watching for signs of resolution. Industries with complex supply chains like automotive and pharmaceuticals faced new costs and disruptions. Retaliatory measures strained diplomatic ties, even with long-standing allies. The era of predictable, cooperative trade gave way to a more contentious global environment. Free trade principles were under threat, and alliances were being tested. Persistent tariffs forced American corporations to rethink their global strategies. Companies like Amazon and Apple began diversifying supply chains, shifting production to countries beyond China. The administration's unwavering stance signaled that tariffs were here to stay. Businesses moved from lobbying to adapting, building more resilient operations. The financial burden of tariffs landed on U.S. consumers, fueling inflation concerns. Retaliation from global partners strained alliances and complicated business planning. The future of global trade and American retail remains uncertain, with supply chains being redrawn. The central question: can the American retail model, built on global efficiency and low prices, survive this new era?